The words swam before her eyes, yet Margaret Holloway could not look away. Her fingers trembled against the crisp pages of Lord Blackwood's newest triumph, and the morning light filtering through the bookshop window seemed to turn cold as winter's steel. There it was, page 117. When the north wind speaks, only the forgotten listen, for they alone remember what the world chose to bury. The book slipped from her hands. It struck the wooden floor with a sound like a gunshot, and Margaret gripped the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. The smell of fresh ink rose from the scattered pages, mixing with the familiar sense of her tiny shop on Candlemaker Row. Paper dust, black tea, lavender, home. But those words did not belong in this book. Those words belonged to her father. She knelt slowly, her wool skirt pooling around her like mourning cloth, and retrieved the fallen volume. Her spectacles had slipped down her nose, and she pushed them back with fingers stained permanent gray from years of typographic ink. William Holloway had whispered that phrase to her when she was 9 years old, sitting on his knee in a cramped London flat while rain hammered the windows. "It is my secret prayer, little mouse," he had said, "never written down, only for you and me." And now it stared at her from the pages of Edmund Blackwood's celebrated novel, The Voice from the Hills. The book all of Edinburgh was devouring. The book that had earned its author invitations to every salon, every literary gathering, every gleaming parlor in Scotland. Margaret turned more pages. Her breath came faster. Another phrase, then another. An entire paragraph describing the Highland moors that her father had composed during his final, poverty-stricken years. She recognized his rhythm, his particular way of pausing between thoughts, the melancholy that dripped from every syllable like rain from autumn leaves. This was not inspiration. This was theft. 8 years her father had been dead. 8 years since she had found him cold in his bed, his last unpublished manuscript missing from his desk. 8 years she had mourned both the man and his final work, believing it lost forever. It had not been lost. It had been stolen. The bell above her shop door chimed, and Margaret shoved the book beneath the counter with shaking hands. Old Mrs. Patterson entered, wanting her weekly novel, and Margaret served her with a smile that felt like broken glass against her lips. The moment the door closed again, she grabbed her coat. The streets of Edinburgh were slick with morning rain as Margaret climbed toward Greyfriars Kirkyard. The ancient cemetery sprawled across the hillside like a gray quilt stitched with stone, and she moved between the monuments until she found the modest marker she sought. William Holloway, writer, father, forgotten by the world, remembered by his daughter. She had paid for that stone herself. Every penny scraped together from 7 years of selling other people's words. "They stole your voice, Papa," she whispered, kneeling in the wet grass. Her spectacles fogged in the cold air, and she removed them, polishing the lenses with her sleeve. The world blurred into gray shapes. "I found it today, in his book. Your private prayer, your secret words. He took them. He took everything." The rain intensified, drumming against the headstones, plastering Margaret's dark hair to her cheeks. She did not move. "I swear to you," she continued, her voice hardening into something that surprised her, "I will take it back. Your name, your legacy, everything he stole. I will make the world remember William Holloway." A movement caught her eye. Near the neighboring grave, a figure in a black coat stood watching her. A man with sharp features and tired eyes, his collar turned up against the weather. When their gazes met, he did not look away. Margaret rose quickly, embarrassment heating her cheeks. Grieving daughters did not make public oaths to the dead. She hurried past him without speaking, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the iron sky. At the cemetery gate, something made her turn back. Her father's grave was visible from here, small and humble among the grander monuments. There was something white on top of the stone that had not been there before. A lily, fresh and perfect, its petals beaded with rain. She had not left it. The stranger had vanished. Who then remembered her forgotten father? That evening, Margaret committed an act of desperate courage. She talked her way into Lady Mackintosh's literary salon by arriving with a delivery of rare books, then lingered in the shadows while the cream of Edinburgh society gathered in rooms that smelled of hothouse flowers and expensive candle wax. Lord Edmund Blackwood stood near the marble fireplace, a crystal glass in his manicured hand. He was tall and distinguished, with silver threading his dark hair and the kind of easy smile that came from a lifetime of privilege. Around him, admirers fluttered like moths to a flame. "Read us something, Edmund," a woman pleaded. "Something from the new book." Blackwood performed humility with practiced grace. "If the company insists." A servant brought him the book. That book. Margaret's chest constricted as if iron bands were tightening around her ribs. She watched him open to a marked page, clear his throat, and begin. "The mountains do not forgive," Blackwood read, his rich voice carrying through the silent room. "They merely wait. And in their waiting, they accumulate the sorrows of all who pass beneath their shadow." Applause rippled through the assembly. Margaret tasted bile. Those were her father's words about Ben Nevis, written during their only family holiday when Margaret was 12 and her mother was still alive. Words never published. Words that existed only in a manuscript that had vanished the night William Holloway died. She moved before she could stop herself. "Lord Blackwood!" The crowd parted in confusion. Margaret stood before the celebrated author, her plain wool dress and ink-stained fingers marking her as someone who did not belong. "You have captured something remarkable in your writing," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The way you describe the Highlands, so intimate, so personal. One might almost think you had lived those experiences rather than invented them." Blackwood's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition? Fear? "All writing is lived experience transformed by imagination, madam." "Indeed. And inspiration, where does that come from? Do you breathe it in like air?" "Precisely," he replied smoothly. "Inspiration belongs to everyone. The gift is knowing how to capture it." "The gift," Margaret repeated. "Yes. Some people have it, and some people take it." A woman materialized at Blackwood's elbow, Cecilia Price, the nightingale of Edinburgh, her golden curls piled high and her silk dress the color of spring violets. She draped herself against Blackwood's arm with proprietary ease. "Edmund, darling, who is this?" "A bookseller, I believe," Blackwood said dismissively. Cecilia's laugh was like breaking crystal. "How delightful! A bookworm among the butterflies. Tell me, dear, do you actually read the things you sell, or do you just count the pennies?" The room tittered. Margaret felt heat climbing her neck. "I read everything, Miss Price, including poetry, though I confess I find some modern verse rather derivative. All surface beauty and borrowed sentiment." Cecilia's smile froze. "I am sure your literary opinions are endlessly fascinating to your customers," she said sweetly. "Now do run along. The servant's entrance is through the kitchen." Margaret held her ground for one more heartbeat, her gaze locked with Blackwood's. Then she turned and walked toward the door with dignity she did not feel. She was nearly at the entrance when voices reached her from behind a velvet curtain. The Edinburgh Review received a curious inquiry today. A woman asking about original manuscripts. Blackwood's voice, low and urgent. "It is nothing. A lunatic." "Even so, burn all the drafts, especially the ones on the old paper. By morning, nothing should remain." Margaret's hand found the door handle. Her heart hammered against her ribs. By morning, the evidence would be ash. Margaret spent the night surrounded by ghosts. Her father's letters lay scattered across the narrow bed in her room above the bookshop, yellowed pages covered in his distinctive leftward slanting script. She read each one by candlelight until her eyes burned, searching for proof that could not be dismissed. The third letter, dated 1882, made her hands shake. "My dearest Margaret," her father had written, "the new manuscript progresses well. I have titled it The Voice from the Hills, and it concerns a man who loses everything to the Highland clearances. The opening chapter describes the north wind as a messenger of forgotten souls. I believe this may be my finest work." The same title, the same imagery. 8 years before Blackwood's celebrated novel appeared in bookshops across Britain. Dawn crept through her window, painting the cramped room in shades of pewter and rose. Margaret gathered the letters carefully, tied them with string, and dressed in her most respectable gray dress. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, but clean, presentable enough for the offices of the Edinburgh Literary Review. The editorial rooms occupied the second floor of a soot-stained building on Prince's Street. Margaret climbed the stairs with her bundle of evidence pressed against her chest like armor. A clerk with ink-stained fingers and a bored expression looked up from his desk. "I need to speak with the editor," Margaret said. "It concerns a matter of literary theft." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Hartley sees visitors by appointment only." "Tell him it involves Lord Blackwood." Something shifted in the clerk's expression. Interest, perhaps. Or warning. "Wait here." 20 minutes later, Margaret sat across from Douglas Hartley in an office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. The editor was a heavy man with mutton-chop whiskers and small, calculating eyes that reminded her of a pig assessing the quality of its slop. She laid out her case, the letters, the matching phrases, the manuscript that had vanished the night her father died. Hartley listened without interruption, his thick fingers steepled beneath his chin. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Miss Holloway," he said finally, "these are serious accusations against a man of considerable reputation." "I have proof. The dates on these letters predate his novel by nearly a decade." "Letters can be forged." "My father's handwriting can be verified. There are samples in the British Museum archive. He corresponded with several notable scholars." Hartley shifted in his chair. The leather creaked beneath his weight. "I appreciate your passion, Miss Holloway. Truly. But Lord Blackwood is a pillar of this city's literary community. His patronage supports young writers, charitable causes, the arts themselves. An accusation like this, without irrefutable evidence, would destroy careers, including yours. I am a bookseller. I have no career to destroy. Everyone has something to lose. The door opened behind her. Margaret turned and felt the blood drain from her face. A police constable stood in the doorway, his uniform buttons gleaming dully in the gray morning light. Behind him, a second officer waited. "Miss Margaret Holloway?" the first constable asked. "Yes." "You are required to accompany us to the station. A complaint has been filed regarding harassment and defamation of character." Margaret rose slowly. Her legs felt disconnected from her body. "By whom?" "Lord Edmund Blackwood." The station house smelled of damp wool and despair. Margaret sat on a wooden bench in a corridor painted institutional green, watching constables pass with drunks and pickpockets. An hour crawled by, then another. Finally, a sergeant with a gray mustache and tired eyes called her into a small interview room. "Lord Blackwood has lodged a formal complaint," he said without preamble. "You have been following him, accosting him at social gatherings, making wild accusations that damage his reputation." "I spoke to him once, at a public event." "He claims you have been stalking him for weeks, that you suffer from delusions. His physician is prepared to testify that such behavior is consistent with female hysteria." The word hung in the air between them. Hysteria. The convenient diagnosis that had locked countless inconvenient women behind asylum walls. "I am not hysterical. I am seeking justice for my dead father." The sergeant leaned back in his chair. "Miss Holloway, I have no desire to see a respectable woman committed to bedlam. But Lord Blackwood is a powerful man. If you continue this campaign against him, I cannot protect you from the consequences." They released her with a warning. Do not approach Lord Blackwood. Do not speak publicly against him. Do not make trouble. Margaret walked out into the Edinburgh afternoon with the taste of ash on her tongue. Across the street, a carriage waited. The door bore no crest, but through the rain-streaked window, Margaret could see a face watching her. Golden curls. A smile like a knife wrapped in silk. Cecilia Price raised one gloved hand in a mocking wave as the carriage pulled away. Night had fallen by the time Margaret returned to her shop. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room without lighting a lamp, wanting only darkness and silence. The letters from her father still lay scattered across the bed. Evidence that proved nothing. Words that no one would believe. She sank into the single chair by the cold fireplace and let the tears come. "They will never listen," she whispered to the empty room. "The word of a bookseller against a lord. I have nothing." A knock at the door made her freeze. Margaret wiped her face quickly and descended the stairs. Through the shop window she could see a figure on the doorstep. Tall, male, wearing a black coat she recognized from the cemetery. She opened the door a crack. "Miss Holloway." The man's voice was low and rough, as if he had spent years shouting into wind. "My name is Daniel Ross. I saw you at Lady Mackintosh's salon, and at your father's grave this morning." "You left the Lily?" "I did." "Why?" Ross glanced over his shoulder at the empty street. "May I come in? What I have to say should not be spoken where others might hear." Against every instinct, Margaret stepped aside. He moved through her shop with the careful attention of a man accustomed to noticing details. His eyes lingered on the shelves, the worn floorboards, the small desk where she edited manuscripts under a false name. "You were a friend of my father," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I knew him. Friend is perhaps too generous a word." "Then why are you here?" Ross turned to face her. In the dim light filtering through the shop window, his features looked carved from granite. Tired eyes, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. "Because I heard what you said to Blackwood tonight, and I know you were right. He is a thief, a fraud, a man who builds his castles on the bones of better writers." Margaret's heart stuttered. "You believe me?" "I do not need to believe you. I know. Because 8 years ago, Edmund Blackwood destroyed my career using the same methods he used against your father." He reached into his coat and withdrew a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Margaret took it with trembling fingers. The headline read, "Rising author Daniel Ross accused of plagiarism. Literary career in ruins." It was a lie, Ross said quietly. Every word. Blackwood planted false evidence, bribed witnesses, manufactured the entire scandal. I was 23 years old and I had just published my first novel to considerable acclaim. He saw me as competition, so he erased me. "Why did no one defend you?" "Your father tried." The words struck Margaret like a physical blow. "What?" "William Holloway was the only person in Edinburgh who believed my innocence. He wrote letters to editors. He confronted Blackwood publicly. He made himself an enemy." Ross's jaw tightened. 6 months later, your father was dead, and his unpublished manuscript had vanished. I have spent 8 years knowing the truth and being unable to prove it, until tonight. Margaret stared at the clipping in her hands. The date was 1884, 2 years before her father died. "The police threaten me with bedlam," she said slowly. "They will never investigate a lord on the word of a bookseller." "No," Ross agreed. "They will not, which is why we cannot fight him with words." "Then how?" Ross moved closer. His eyes burned with something Margaret recognized, the same cold flame that had ignited in her own chest when she read her father's words in Blackwood's book. "We fight him with evidence, real evidence. In his printing house, there are original galley proofs of the voice from the hills. The typesetter's copies, with handwritten corrections. If those corrections were made in your father's hand, not Blackwood's, then we have proof that cannot be dismissed." "How do you know this?" "Because I know how publishing works, and because I have spent 8 years watching Blackwood, waiting for a weakness." Margaret set down the clipping. "Why should I trust you? I met you this morning. You could be anyone, a spy sent by Blackwood himself." Ross nodded slowly. "You are right to be cautious. Trust is earned, not given. So let me earn it. Come with me tomorrow night. I know how to get into the printing house. See the evidence with your own eyes. Then decide." Margaret looked at this stranger with his haunted eyes and granite jaw. Every rational thought told her to refuse. He could be leading her into a trap. He could be mad. He could be working for the enemy. But her father's words echoed in her memory. When the north wind speaks, only the forgotten listen. She had been forgotten. So had Ross. Perhaps the forgotten were the only ones who could hear the truth. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Where do we meet?" "The Doers Tavern, near the port. 10 o'clock. Ross moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Holloway, there is something else you should know." "Yes?" His voice dropped to barely a whisper. 8 years ago, I did not just know your father. He saved my life when I had nothing left. He gave me hope when the world had taken everything. And I have carried the guilt of failing him ever since." He opened the door and stepped into the night. "I was the one who introduced him to Blackwood," he said without turning back. "I thought I was helping him find a patron. Instead, I led him to his destroyer." The Doers Tavern crouched at the edge of Leith Docks like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Fog rolled in from the Firth of Forth, carrying the smell of salt and rotting fish, and Margaret pulled her dark shawl tighter as she pushed through the scarred wooden door. Inside, the air hung thick with pipe smoke and the sour tang of cheap ale. Sailors hunched over tables, speaking in languages she did not recognize. A woman with painted lips laughed too loudly in the corner. No one looked at Margaret twice. Ross waited at a table near the back, 2 untouched glasses before him. "You came," he said. "Did you think I would not?" "I thought you might come to your senses." Margaret sat across from him. The bench was sticky beneath her skirts, and she tried not to think about what might have been spilled there. "Tell me the plan." Ross leaned forward, his voice dropping beneath the tavern's noise. "Constable and Company handles all of Blackwood's printing. They keep archives of every book they produce. Original galleys, correction sheets, proof copies, everything a court would need to establish authorship. And these archives are simply available for inspection. They are locked in a basement storage room, but the coal delivery chute has a faulty grate. I've checked it myself." Margaret studied his face. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. The set of his jaw suggested a man who had stopped caring about consequences. "You have been planning this for some time." 8 years, Miss Holloway. 8 years of watching him preen and profit while better men rotted in obscurity. Your father was not his only victim, merely the one whose daughter refuses to stay silent. The words landed like stones in still water. Margaret thought of her father's grave, the modest headstone she had scraped together pennies to afford, the lily Ross had left in the rain. "When do we go?" "Tonight. The night watchman drinks at the Sheep Hide Inn every Tuesday until midnight. We will have 3 hours." The printing house rose from the darkness like a sleeping giant, its chimneys cold and silent against the starless sky. Margaret and Ross approached from the rear, moving through a narrow alley that stank of ink and industrial chemicals. "There," Ross whispered, pointing to a grate set low in the building's foundation. "The coal chute." He knelt and worked at the rusted metal with practiced hands. The grate groaned, but gave way, revealing a square of absolute blackness. "I will go first," he said. "Count to 20, then follow." He disappeared into the hole. Margaret counted in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smell of coal dust drifted up from the opening, mixing with something else. Machine oil. Paper. The ghost of countless books born in this place. At 20, she lowered herself through. The drop was longer than she expected. She landed hard on a pile of coal, biting back a cry as sharp edges dug into her palms. Ross's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "This way." They moved through absolute darkness, Ross leading with one hand against the wall. Margaret followed the sound of his footsteps, her free hand stretched before her like a blind woman seeking obstacles. The floor changed from coal to stone to wood. The air grew warmer, heavy with the chemical sharpness of printing ink. A match flared. Ross held it high, revealing a narrow corridor lined with shelves. Thousands of documents pressed together like leaves in an ancient forest. "The archives," he said. "Constable keeps everything. Every galley proof, every correction sheet, every letter from every author they have published in 50 years. "How do we find Blackwood's files?" "Alphabetical by author surname. This way." They moved deeper into the labyrinth. The match died, and Ross lit another. Shadows leaped and twisted across the shelves like living things. Margaret read names as they passed: Barry, Burns, Carlyle. The literary history of Scotland compressed into paper and dust. Here. The folder was thick, bound with string and marked in neat handwriting. Blackwood, Edmund. The Voice from the Hills. First edition. Margaret's fingers trembled as she untied the string. Inside, she found what she had been seeking. The original galley proofs, covered in handwritten corrections. Notes in the margins. Alterations to phrasing. She held the first page up to Ross's matchlight, and her breath stopped in her throat. The handwriting slanted left. Each letter formed with the particular flourish she had known since childhood. The notation at the bottom read, "Changed north to eastern, per publisher request. Original phrasing preferred." Her father's hand, unmistakable. "It is him," she whispered. "It is his writing. He made these corrections. He was the author." Ross moved closer, examining the pages. "This is everything we need. Names, dates, proof that Blackwood did not write a single word of this book." Margaret gathered the pages with shaking hands. 8 years of grief and rage crystallized into this moment. Paper evidence that could restore her father's name and destroy the man who had stolen it. "We need to leave," Ross said. "Now." They retraced their steps through the archive, moving faster now. Margaret clutched the folder against her chest like a shield. The coal chute appeared ahead, a square of gray against the darkness. Ross climbed first, pulling himself through the opening with practiced ease. He reached back for Margaret. "Give me the folder, then take my hand." She passed the precious documents up to him, then grasped his fingers. The stone edge scraped against her ribs as he pulled her through. Cold night air rushed into her lungs. And then she heard the voice. "Thief." The word echoed off the alley walls. Margaret stumbled upright, Ross's hand still gripping her arm, and turned toward the sound. Cecilia Price stood at the alley's entrance, her golden curls hidden beneath a dark hood. Behind her, 2 large men held torches that cast dancing shadows across the cobblestones. "I told Edmund you would try something foolish," Cecilia said, walking closer. "He thought you would slink away after the police warning. But I know women like you. Desperate, pathetic, unable to accept your proper place.
This does not concern you, Miss Price.
Everything concerning Edmund concerns me. He is my protector, my patron, my future husband, once his tiresome wife finally succumbs to her illness.
The cruelty in her voice was absolute. Margaret felt Ross tense beside her. "We are leaving," he said.
"No, you are not."
Cecilia raised her hand. The two men started forward.
"You see,"
Cecilia continued,
"I followed you tonight. I watched you break into this building. I witnessed you steal documents. And now I am going to summon the constables and have you both arrested for burglary." Margaret's mind raced. The folder was still in Ross's hands. The evidence that could save them in court would also prove they had been inside the printing house.
"Run,"
Ross said quietly.
"What?"
"When I move, run. Do not stop. Do not look back." Before Margaret could respond, Ross hurled himself at the two men. The torch of the first one went flying, scattering sparks across the wet cobblestones. Shouts erupted. Fists connected with flesh. Margaret ran. She clutched the folder to her chest and sprinted down the alley, her boots slipping on the slick stones. Behind her, she heard Cecilia screaming for help, Ross grunting in pain, the sounds of struggle growing fainter as she fled. Left turn, right turn, through a courtyard where startled cats scattered before her, over a low wall that tore her skirt, across a bridge spanning a canal that gleamed like black glass in the moonlight. She did not stop until her lungs burned and her legs refused to carry her further. An abandoned warehouse loomed before her, its doors hanging open. Margaret stumbled inside and collapsed against a pillar, gasping for air. Only then did she look down at the folder in her arms. Smoke curled from the edges. Margaret tore the folder open with numb fingers. Inside, the pages were charring, eaten by flames that seemed to come from nowhere. A thin wire protruded from the binding. Some kind of fuse. Some kind of trap. She tried to beat out the fire with her bare hands. The heat seared her palms. Page after page crumbled to black ash, her father's handwriting dissolving into nothing. By the time Ross found her, only 3 pages remained. He appeared in the warehouse doorway, breathing hard. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye. His coat was torn. "Margaret?" She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. The remains of the evidence scattered around her like funeral confetti. "It was a trap," she said. "There was something in the binding. The pages caught fire." Ross knelt beside her. He took the 3 surviving sheets with gentle hands, examining them in the pale light filtering through the broken roof. 3 pages, he said quietly. It is not enough. It is not enough to prove anything. Perhaps. Perhaps not. He pointed to a name scrawled at the bottom of one page, a witness signature, someone who had verified the original corrections. Thomas Gray, Ross read. He was the typesetter who prepared the original galleys. If he is still alive, if he remembers. One old man's memory against a lord's reputation? It is more than we had this morning. Margaret wiped her face with her burned hands. The pain barely registered. 8 years of hope had burned to ash in her arms, and only fragments remained. But fragments were better than nothing. How do we find him? Thomas Gray would be in his 60s now, if he still lives. Former typesetters do not age well. The lead poisoning takes them young.
Ross helped her to her feet. There is a district called Cowgate.
The workers who serve the printing houses retire there, or die there. If Gray is anywhere, that is where we will find him. Margaret looked down at the ashes scattered across the warehouse floor. Her father's words reduced to dust. His legacy almost lost forever. Almost. She tucked the 3 surviving pages into her bodice, close to her heart. Then we go to Cowgate. The ashes were still warm when Margaret returned to her bookshop at dawn. She had not slept. Her hands throbbed with burns that would leave scars, and her mind kept replaying the moment when flames consumed her father's words. 8 years of waiting. 1 night of hope. And now, 3 fragile pages hidden against her heart. She washed the soot from her face in the small basin behind the counter, watching the water turn gray. Her reflection stared back from the tarnished mirror. Hollowed eyes, cracked lips. A woman who had aged 10 years in a single night. Ross had promised to meet her at noon. They would go to Cowgate together, search for the typesetter whose name survived the fire. Thomas Gray, their last remaining thread. But first, Margaret needed to understand the depth of her enemy's cruelty. She dressed in her cleanest dress and walked to the Prince Coffee House on George Street. The establishment catered to Edinburgh's literary elite, all velvet chairs and gilded mirrors, and the gentle clink of fine china. Margaret did not belong here. She knew it. Every patron who glanced her way knew it. But she needed to see them. Blackwood and his serpent. They sat at a corner table by the window, sunlight streaming across their shoulders like a blessing. Cecilia Price wore a gown the color of crushed roses, diamonds glittering at her throat. She laughed at something Blackwood said, throwing her golden head back with practiced grace. No shadows beneath her eyes, no tension in her shoulders. She had watched Margaret's evidence burn and slept soundly afterward. A waiter approached Margaret with barely concealed disdain. "May I help you, madam?" "Tea, please, black." She chose a table where she could observe without being noticed. The coffee house hummed with conversation, deals being struck, reputations being made and destroyed with casual words over breakfast pastries. Cecilia's voice carried across the room, pitched for maximum audience. "My new collection releases next week," she announced to her admirers. "The publisher says it is my finest work yet. Every poem written from the depths of my soul." "You are too modest, darling," Blackwood murmured. "Modesty is for those with nothing to be proud of." The table erupted in appreciative laughter. Margaret gripped her teacup until her burned fingers screamed in protest. A young woman approached Cecilia's table, shabbily dressed, nervous, clutching a folded paper in her trembling hands. "Miss Price, I am sorry to disturb you. I sent you my poems last month. You said you might help me find a publisher." Cecilia's smile did not waver, but something cold entered her eyes. "I received so many submissions, dear. Remind me of your work." "The sonnet cycle about my mother's death. You wrote back saying it showed promise." "Ah, yes, I remember now. Unfortunately, the style was too similar to pieces I had already written myself. I could not recommend something so derivative." The young woman's face crumpled. "Derivative? But I wrote them from my own experience. My mother died in my arms." "Grief is universal, darling. The expression of it should be unique." Cecilia waved her hand in dismissal. The young woman stumbled away,
tears streaming down her cheeks. At her table, Cecilia returned to her champagne and her admirers without missing a beat. Margaret understood then. The poem Cecilia would publish next week. The sonnet cycle about a mother's death, stolen from a grieving daughter who would never see credit for her own pain. She left coins on her table and walked out into the gray Edinburgh morning. Cowgate descended into the earth like a wound. The street ran through a ravine created by the bridges above, receiving sunlight only at noon on the clearest days. Buildings leaned against each other like drunks seeking support, their walls stained with generations of coal smoke and despair. Ross waited at the entrance, his face grim. "The Typesetters Guild keeps records of retired workers," he said. "Thomas Gray is listed at 14 South Bridge Close, if he still lives." They walked into the shadows together. The smell hit Margaret first. Human waste and rotting vegetables, and the particular sour stench of poverty that clung to everything it touched. Children with hollow eyes watched them pass. Women with lined faces and broken teeth called offers from doorways. Men coughed the wet, rattling cough of lungs filled with coal dust and factory smoke. "Your father walked these streets," Ross said quietly, "before he found success. He told me once that poverty was the finest teacher. It taught him what mattered and what did not." "He never talked about those years with me." "He wanted to protect you from knowing how close you came to this life." 14 South Bridge Close was a crumbling tenement that seemed to sag beneath the weight of its own misery. They climbed stairs that groaned with each step, past doors behind which babies cried and couples argued and someone played a mournful tune on a broken fiddle. The top floor held a single room. Ross knocked. "Go away," a voice croaked from within. "I've nothing worth stealing." "Mr. Gray? My name is Daniel Ross. I'm here about a book you helped print. The Voice from the Hills." Silence. Then the shuffle of feet, and the door creaked open. Thomas Gray had been tall once. Margaret could see it in his stooped shoulders, the way his frame seemed to fold in on itself like paper crushed by time. His skin had the yellow pallor of lead poisoning, and his breath rattled with each word. But his eyes remained sharp, glittering with intelligence in a ruined body. "I wondered when someone would come asking about that book," he said. They entered the tiny room. A bed, a chair, a window so grimy it admitted light only as a suggestion. The smell of sickness hung heavy in the air. "You remember the printing?" Margaret asked. "I remember everything, miss. My body is failing, but my mind remains sharp as the day I set my first line of type. A curse, perhaps. Forgetting would be easier." He lowered himself into the chair with a wince. "Lord Blackwood brought that manuscript to us in 1886. Said it was his masterwork. But I knew within the first page that he had not written it." "How?" "The corrections, miss. When an author reviews his own work, he makes certain kinds of changes, smoothing phrases, improving rhythm. But when a man reads something he did not write, he makes different corrections. He changes words he does not understand. He simplifies passages beyond his comprehension." Thomas coughed, a wet sound that seemed to tear something loose in his chest. The handwriting on those corrections was not Blackwood's. Different slant, different pressure. The hand of a man who truly understood the words he had written. "My father's hand," Margaret whispered. I suspected as much when I heard William Holloway had died. The timing was too convenient. The manuscript appeared mere months after his passing. Ross leaned forward. "Would you testify to this in court?" Thomas laughed, a bitter sound that dissolved into coughing. "Testify? Look at me, sir. I will not live to see another spring.
The lead has eaten my lungs, my liver, my very bones. I have perhaps weeks remaining." "Then sign a statement, an affidavit, something we can use after you are gone." And what good would the word of a dying typesetter do against the word of a lord? Blackwood paid me £50 to forget what I saw. £50 that kept my children fed for a year. When I tried to speak up later, he sent men to remind me of the consequences of broken silence. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing scars that crisscrossed his forearm. Paper means nothing against his power. Only public humiliation can bring down a man like Edmund Blackwood. Margaret felt hope slipping through her fingers again. Another witness, another dead end. "I will sign your paper," Thomas said quietly, "for what little it may be worth. But words on a page cannot defeat him. Only his own arrogance can do that." "What do you mean?" Thomas Gray smiled, and for a moment, Margaret saw the sharp young man he had once been. "Blackwood is vain. He has never read his own books cover to cover. He trusts the printers, the editors, the publisher. He stands at readings and performs words he has barely glanced at, relying on his charm to carry him through." "I do not understand," Ross said. "Then let me speak plainly. If you could change what he reads aloud, he would not notice until the words left his mouth. He would condemn himself in front of everyone, speaking his own guilt without realizing what he was saying." Margaret stared at the dying man. "Replace the pages of his book?" "Replace the final chapter of his next reading. I hear he has a grand event planned, the anniversary of The Voice from the Hills. All of Edinburgh will attend." Ross and Margaret exchanged glances. "The galley proofs are prepared weeks in advance," Thomas continued. "I may be dying, but I still know people in the trade. I can tell you exactly when and where those proofs will be vulnerable." Margaret thought of her father's voice, stolen and silenced for 8 years. She thought of Blackwood standing in gilded rooms, accepting praise for words he had not written. She thought of the young woman weeping in the coffee house while Cecilia Price laughed. "Tell us everything," she said. Thomas Gray leaned back in his chair. Outside, the sun had reached its brief noon position, sending a single shaft of light through the grimy window. It fell across his face like a benediction. "Bring me paper and ink," he said, "and prepare yourselves. What I am about to suggest will either restore your father's name or destroy you both completely." Thomas Gray died on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after sharing his secrets. Margaret learned of his passing from a brief notice in the Edinburgh Evening Courant, 4 lines buried between advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of livestock auctions. The notice did not mention his 40 years in the printing trade. It did not mention the books that had passed through his skilled hands. It merely stated that Thomas Gray, aged 63, had succumbed to illness at his residence in Cowgate. She attended the funeral alone. Ross had business at the docks, following a lead on one of Blackwood's financial backers. The ceremony took place in a cramped chapel that smelled of mildew and candle wax, attended by a handful of former colleagues too old or too sick to work. The minister spoke words that could have applied to anyone. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, a life summarized in platitudes. But Thomas had not died without purpose. Before his final breath, he had given them everything. The schedule of Blackwood's upcoming reading, the location of the printing house where the commemorative edition was being prepared, the name of a young compositor who owed Thomas a debt that death could not erase. And most importantly, he had signed the affidavit. Margaret carried it now, folded against her heart beside the 3 surviving pages from the fire. A dying man's testimony, witnessed by Ross and notarized by a sympathetic solicitor who asked no questions about the contents. Not enough to win in court, but perhaps enough to plant seeds of doubt. After the funeral, she walked to the old college library. The reading room stretched before her like a cathedral to knowledge, its vaulted ceilings and endless shelves offering sanctuary from the grimy streets outside. She requested the archived newspapers from 1884, the year Daniel Ross had fallen. The scandal had dominated the literary pages for weeks. Promising author accused of wholesale plagiarism. Ross novel allegedly stolen from obscure German work. Literary community shocked by betrayal of trust. Margaret read every article. The accusations had emerged from nowhere. Supported by a German professor who claimed Ross had copied his unpublished manuscript. Letters were produced. Witnesses came forward. The evidence seemed overwhelming. But one detail caught her attention. The German professor had died 6 months after the scandal, leaving no family and no estate. His papers had been purchased by an anonymous collector. She cross-referenced the dates. The collector had acquired the papers in November of 1884. That same month, Edmund Blackwood had made a substantial donation to a German university library. Coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps the threads of a conspiracy that stretched further than she had imagined. Ross found her at the library as evening fell. "I spoke with McPherson at the docks," he said, sliding into the chair beside her. "Blackwood imports paper from a mill in Denmark. The shipments arrive quarterly." And the next one is scheduled for the week before his anniversary reading. Why does that matter? Because the commemorative edition requires special paper, heavy stock, cream-colored, watermarked with Blackwood's personal crest. If that shipment were delayed, the printing house would need to use substitute stock. Margaret frowned. "I do not understand how that helps us." Thomas said the compositor owes him a debt, but the compositor cannot alter the pages if supervisors are watching. A delay in the paper shipment would create chaos, reprinting, rescheduling, confusion. In that confusion, pages could be switched without anyone noticing until it was too late. The pieces began to connect in Margaret's mind. "You want to sabotage the shipment. I want to create an opportunity. What we do with that opportunity is the real question." They left the library as the lamplighters made their rounds. Edinburgh transformed at dusk, its rational Georgian facades giving way to shadows and secrets. Gas lamps flickered to life like earthbound stars, casting pools of gold across the gray cobblestones. "I found something in the archives," Margaret said as they walked. "The German professor who accused you. He died without heirs. His papers were bought by someone connected to Blackwood." Ross stopped walking. "I suspected as much. But suspicion and proof are different things. Perhaps we can find the proof. If Blackwood purchased those papers to conceal his fraud against you, they might still exist, hidden somewhere, evidence of the manufactured scandal. His house, Ross said slowly. Blackwood Manor has a private library. He boasts about it constantly. Thousands of rare manuscripts. Personal correspondence from famous authors. Including, perhaps, letters that prove his guilt. Getting into that library would be impossible. The manor is guarded, his servants are loyal, and after the printing house fire, he will be watching for exactly this kind of attempt. Margaret thought of Cecilia Price lounging in the coffee house while a young poet wept over stolen words. She thought of the salon where Edinburgh's elite gathered to worship at the altar of a fraud. "We do not need to break in," she said. "We need to be invited." Ross stared at her. "Invited? Have you forgotten who we are? You are a bookseller he has threatened with bedlam. I am a ruined author he destroyed 8 years ago. Neither of us would make it past his front gate." "Not as ourselves, but Blackwood collects rare manuscripts." If we had something valuable enough, something he could not resist, he might overlook who was offering it. What could we possibly have that would interest him? Margaret smiled, and even she was surprised by the cold satisfaction in it. My father's final manuscript was not his only work. Before he died, he completed a translation of an ancient Gaelic text, a collection of Highland legends never before rendered into English. He could not find a publisher because the market for such things was limited. "And you have this translation?" "Hidden in my shop, behind a false panel my father built. I could never bring myself to sell it. But if Blackwood believed he was acquiring something unique, something that would enhance his reputation as a collector of rare literary works," Ross began to understand. "He would invite you to the manor himself, to authenticate the manuscript, to negotiate the sale. And once inside, I could look for the evidence we need." "It is too dangerous. If he suspects your true purpose..." "You will never leave that house." Margaret met his eyes. "My father gave everything for his words. His reputation, his health, his life. The least I can do is risk the same." They did not speak again until they reached Margaret's shop. The narrow building huddled between a tailor and a chandler, its windows displaying volumes that few customers ever purchased. But it was hers, built from nothing, a monument to survival. "There is something I should tell you," Ross said, pausing at the door. "Yes?" "Thomas Gray spoke to me before he died. Privately. He said something that has troubled me ever since." Margaret waited. "He said Blackwood has a private safe in his study, behind a portrait of his late father. In that safe he keeps the original manuscript of The Voice from the Hills, not a copy. The original, in your father's hand." "Why would he keep such a thing?" "Vanity, perhaps, or insurance. Thomas believed Blackwood enjoys owning the evidence of his own crimes. It gives him a sense of power over his victims, even after they are dead." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "If I could get into that safe..." "You would have proof that no one could deny. Your father's original manuscript hidden in the house of the man who claimed to write it." The gas lamp above the shop door flickered, casting Ross's face in alternating light and shadow. "But the safe requires a combination," he continued, "and Blackwood changes it regularly. You would need to be in his study alone, with time to search. That kind of opportunity would be almost impossible to create." Margaret looked at the shop her father had helped her establish, the books he had loved, the trade he had taught her. Every shelf represented a piece of him that Blackwood could never steal.
almost impossible, she repeated.
But not entirely. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of paper and ink embraced her like an old friend. "Come," she said to Ross. "I want to show you something." In the back room, behind a shelf of damaged volumes awaiting repair, Margaret pressed a hidden catch. A panel swung open, revealing a cavity in the wall. Inside lay a leather satchel, dusty with age. "My father's translation," she said, lifting it carefully. "Highland legends, fairy tales, the kind of stories that seem worthless until you realize they preserve a dying culture." She opened the satchel and withdrew the manuscript. Pages covered in her father's careful hand, accompanied by notes and annotations that demonstrated years of scholarly work. "Blackwood will not be able to resist this," she said. "He collects authenticity because he has none of his own, and I will use his hunger against him." Ross took the manuscript gently, examining the pages with the eye of a man who understood their true value. "Your father was remarkable," he said quietly. "He was. And the world forgot him because one man decided his voice was worth stealing. I will not let that stand." She took back the manuscript and replaced it in its hiding place. "Send word to Blackwood tomorrow. Tell him a rare collection has come to market. Highland legends never published from the estate of an Edinburgh scholar. Tell him the seller wishes to negotiate privately." "And if he recognizes your father's hand?" "He has never seen it. He had others handle the manuscript. Others do his reading, his editing, his actual work. Edmund Blackwood is nothing but a name attached to talent that was never his." Margaret closed the hidden panel. "It is time to remind him of that." Blackwood Manor rose from the Scottish countryside like a declaration of war against modesty. 3 stories of grey stone, flanked by formal gardens that stretched toward the distant hills. Margaret counted 14 windows on the front facade alone, each one gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that required an army of servants to maintain. The carriage that had collected her from Edinburgh rattled to a stop before the main entrance. A footman in impeccable livery opened the door and offered his gloved hand. "Miss Ashworth," he said, using the false name Ross had provided. "Lord Blackwood awaits you in the library." Margaret smoothed her borrowed dress. A respectable burgundy silk that Ross had acquired through means he refused to explain. The leather satchel containing her father's translation hung heavy against her hip. Bait for a trap she was walking into willingly. The entrance hall could have swallowed her entire bookshop. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers. Portraits of Blackwood ancestors stared down with painted disapproval. Everything spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, of power so deeply rooted it had become invisible to those who wielded it. The footman led her through corridors lined with treasures, Chinese vases, Renaissance tapestries, a suit of armor that had supposedly belonged to Robert the Bruce himself, though Margaret doubted its authenticity. Collectors like Blackwood cared more about the story than the truth. The library doors stood 12 feet tall, carved with scenes of classical learning, philosophers debating, scholars bent over scrolls. The pursuit of knowledge rendered in oak and gilt. "Miss Ashworth," the footman announced. Edmund Blackwood rose from a leather chair by the fireplace. He wore a smoking jacket of midnight blue, and his silver hair caught the firelight like a halo. The image of literary refinement perfected over decades of performance. "Miss Ashworth, welcome to my humble collection." Margaret looked around the library,
Humble was not the word she would have chosen. Thousands of volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Rolling ladders provided access to the highest shelves. Display cases held illuminated manuscripts, first editions, letters signed by authors whose names had shaped literary history. "Your reputation does not do justice to the reality, Lord Blackwood." "Please, call me Edmund. We are colleagues of a sort, are we not? Both devoted to the preservation of literature." He gestured to a chair opposite his own. Margaret sat, placing the satchel carefully on her lap.
"I understand you have acquired something remarkable," he said. "Highland legends, never before published, from the estate of a Scottish scholar." "That is correct." "May I see them?" Margaret withdrew the manuscript with deliberate slowness. She watched Blackwood's face as she handed over the pages, searching for any sign of recognition. But his expression showed only the eager hunger of a collector confronting something new. "Extraordinary," he murmured, turning the pages. "The handwriting is beautiful, precise but passionate. You can feel the author's love for his subject." "The scholar devoted years to this translation. He believed these legends deserved preservation." "And yet he never published?" "He could not find a publisher willing to take the risk. Highland folklore was not fashionable in his time." Blackwood nodded sagely. "The publishing industry has never understood true value. They chase trends while masterpieces languish in obscurity." The hypocrisy nearly choked her. This man, who had built his entire reputation on stolen work, lecturing about the industry's failure to recognize genius. "I would like to add this to my collection," Blackwood continued. "Name your price." "I am not certain I wish to sell, Miss Ashworth. I came today to discuss the possibility, but I would need assurances about how the manuscript would be treated." "Of course. I am a custodian, not merely a collector. These works will be preserved for future generations." He set the manuscript on a side table with reverent care. "Perhaps a tour would help convince you. Let me show you the rest of the collection. You will see that your scholar's work would be an excellent company." They walked through the library together. Blackwood played the role of gracious host, pointing out treasures with practiced ease. A first folio Shakespeare, letters from Byron, the original manuscript of a Waverley novel, purchased at auction for a sum that could have fed the residents of Cowgate for years. Margaret listened and nodded and waited for her opportunity. It came when a servant appeared with a message. "Lord Blackwood, there is a matter requiring your attention in the East Wing, a problem with the preparations for the anniversary reading." Blackwood's expression flickered with annoyance. "Forgive me, Miss Ashworth. These events require constant supervision. Would you mind waiting here? I will return shortly." "Of course." He followed the servant out, and Margaret was alone. She moved immediately to the study door Thomas Gray had described. It stood at the far end of the library, partially concealed behind a decorative screen. The handle turned easily. The study was smaller than the library, but no less opulent. A mahogany desk dominated the center, covered with correspondence and documents. Bookshelves lined the walls, and above the fireplace, exactly where Thomas had said it would be, hung the portrait of Blackwood's father. Margaret crossed to the fireplace. The portrait showed a stern man with the same silver hair, the same cold eyes. The frame appeared fixed to the wall, but Thomas had explained the mechanism. A catch hidden behind the right corner. Her fingers found it,
The portrait swung outward on concealed hinges, revealing a small safe set into the stone. 3 numbered dials, a combination lock. Margaret's heart hammered as she examined the mechanism. Thomas had warned her about this. Blackwood changed the combination frequently, but he was also vain. The numbers would mean something to him. A date, an anniversary. She tried the publication date of The Voice from the Hills. 1890. Nothing. His birthday. Nothing. The date of his first literary award. Nothing. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps passed. She returned to the safe. What would a man like Blackwood consider important enough to remember? Not family, not achievements that others had given him. Something personal. Something that fed his vanity. The date he destroyed Daniel Ross. 1884. The dials clicked into place. The safe door swung open. Inside, Margaret found exactly what Thomas had promised. A leather folder, older and more worn than anything else in Blackwood's pristine collection. She opened it with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting covered every page. The Voice from the Hills, in his own careful script. Notes in the margins, corrections. The complete original manuscript, preserved like a trophy. And beneath it, something else. Letters. Correspondence between Blackwood and the German professor who had destroyed Daniel Ross. Payments. Instructions. A conspiracy laid out in damning detail. Margaret tucked the letters into her bodice and returned the manuscript to the safe. Taking it now would alert Blackwood immediately. But the letters were different. Evidence he might not miss until it was too late. She closed the safe, reset the dials, and swung the portrait back into place. "Miss Ashworth?" Margaret spun. Cecilia Price stood in the doorway, her golden curls arranged perfectly, her smile sharp as broken glass. "I wondered where you had wandered off to." "I was admiring the portrait. Lord Blackwood's father, I assume. His greatest inspiration."
Or so he claims. Cecilia entered the study, her silk skirts whispering against the carpet. She moved with the predatory grace of a cat approaching a trapped mouse.
"Edmund asked me to keep you company while he deals with his tiresome responsibilities. But I confess, I was curious to meet the mysterious Miss Ashworth myself." "There is nothing mysterious about me. I am simply a dealer in rare manuscripts." "Are you?" "Because I have made inquiries. No dealer named Ashworth operates in Edinburgh, or Glasgow, or anywhere in Scotland for that matter." Margaret kept her expression neutral. "I work privately. My clients value discretion." "How convenient."
Cecilia circled closer, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "You remind me of someone. A woman I encountered recently. She was making wild accusations against Edmund, calling him a thief, a fraud. Quite deranged, really." "Edinburgh has no shortage of deranged women, I imagine." "No, but this one had a particular look. Dark hair, determined eyes. The kind of woman who does not know when she has been beaten." Cecilia stopped directly in front of Margaret. They were close enough that Margaret could smell her perfume, roses and something darker beneath. "Edmund had her threatened with bedlam. He thought that would be enough. But I knew better.
Women like that do not surrender. They scheme. They plot. They come back wearing different names and different dresses. Margaret said nothing. "The manuscript you brought today,"
Cecilia continued. "I had a chance to examine it while you were touring the library. The handwriting is distinctive, a leftward slant, elegant but passionate. The same hand that wrote corrections on certain documents in the printing house archives." "I do not know what you are talking about." "Of course you do not, Miss Ashworth." Cecilia smiled, and Margaret saw the trap closing around her. "Edmund will be so disappointed when I tell him who you really are. He had such hopes for that manuscript. But I suppose stolen goods must be returned to their rightful owners." "The manuscript was my father's. It belongs to me." "Your father?" Cecilia laughed softly. "William Holloway, the forgotten scholar, the man who should have stayed forgotten." She reached out and straightened the collar of Margaret's borrowed dress. "I warned Edmund about you, after the printing house, after the police station. I told him you would not stop, but he thought his reputation would protect him. He does not understand how dangerous a woman with nothing to lose can be." "If you understood that, you would not be standing so close to me." Cecilia's smile faltered for just a moment. "Is that a threat, Miss Holloway?" "It is a fact. I have nothing left. My father is dead. His work was stolen. His name was erased. You and your protector have taken everything from me except the truth." Margaret leaned closer. "And the truth is something you cannot steal. You cannot burn it. You cannot threaten it with bedlam. It simply waits until someone is brave enough to speak it." For a long moment they stood face to face, two women who understood exactly what was at stake. Two women who had chosen different paths through a world that offered them nothing but obstacles. Then Cecilia stepped back. "Edmund is returning," she said. "I suggest you compose yourself. The next few minutes will determine whether you leave this house as a guest or as a prisoner." The assembly rooms blazed with light. Hundreds of candles reflected off crystal chandeliers, casting Edinburgh's elite in a golden glow that softened their sharp features and sharper tongues. Margaret watched from the shadows of the entrance hall as carriages disgorged their passengers. Silk gowns and tailored evening coats, diamonds and decorations. The cream of Scottish society gathered to celebrate a lie. 8 years. Tonight marked the 8th anniversary of The Voice from the Hills. 8 years since Edmund Blackwood had stood before audiences just like this one and accepted praise for words he had stolen from a dead man. Margaret touched the letters hidden beneath her bodice. The evidence she had taken from Blackwood's safe remained safe against her skin. But evidence alone would not be enough. She had learned that lesson watching the fire consume her father's corrections at the printing house. Paper could burn. Testimony could be dismissed. Only public humiliation could destroy a man like Blackwood. Ross appeared at her elbow, his face pale with tension. "The compositor did his work," he whispered. "The final chapter has been replaced. Blackwood will read your father's confession without realizing what he is saying until it is too late." "And the guests?" "The Earl of Moray is here, Lady Drummond, Sir Walter Patterson from the Royal Society, 3 newspaper editors and a dozen journalists. If Blackwood stumbles tonight, the whole of Edinburgh will know by morning." Margaret nodded slowly. They had planned this for weeks.
After her narrow escape from Blackwood Manor, after Cecilia's threats and Edmund's forced smile as he watched her leave, they had thrown everything into this final gamble. The paper shipment from Denmark had been delayed by 3 days.
A mysterious accident at the docks, arranged by contacts Ross had cultivated during his years of disgrace. The printing house had fallen into chaos, supervisors scrambling to find substitute stock while deadlines loomed. In that confusion, Thomas Gray's young compositor had done what his mentor had asked of him. A debt repaid from beyond the grave. The altered pages looked identical to the originals. Same typeface, same formatting, same cream-colored paper that Blackwood demanded for all his commemorative editions. But the words had changed. The final chapter, the dramatic climax that audiences always anticipated, now told a different story. A confession, written in the voice of the narrator, but speaking truths that Blackwood had never imagined. "There is something else," Ross said quietly. "Cecilia Price arrived 30 minutes ago. She went directly to Blackwood's private room."
Margaret's stomach tightened. Does she suspect? I do not know. But she has been watching the printing house since the fire. If she noticed anything unusual during the chaos of the last few days, she may have warned him. Then we proceed as planned. If Blackwood knows what is coming, he will refuse to read. But if he does not know, he will perform exactly as he always does, trusting others to prepare his words while he basks in the adoration. The great hall of the assembly rooms had been arranged like a theater. Rows of gilded chairs faced a raised platform where a podium stood beneath a portrait of Blackwood himself. The painting showed him as he wished to be seen, distinguished, intellectual, the beloved voice of Scottish literature. Margaret took her seat near the back, where the shadows offered concealment. Ross sat several rows ahead, positioned to observe Blackwood's face when the moment came.
Around them, Edinburgh's finest settled into their chairs, chattering with the excited anticipation of an audience awaiting a familiar pleasure. A string quartet played softly as the last guests found their places. The music faded, the chandeliers dimmed. Edmund Blackwood walked onto the platform. Applause erupted, the kind of thunderous appreciation that could intoxicate a man. Blackwood absorbed it like sunlight, his silver hair gleaming, his evening clothes immaculate. He raised his hands for silence, and the room obeyed with the discipline of long practice. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners. "Tonight we gather to celebrate something precious. Not merely a book, but a moment in our shared cultural history. 8 years ago, I had the privilege of giving voice to the spirit of our beloved Highlands. Tonight, I share that voice with you once more." More applause. Margaret watched Cecilia Price in the front row. Her golden curls arranged perfectly, her eyes fixed on Blackwood with an expression of theatrical devotion. But something in her posture seemed wrong, too rigid, too alert. Blackwood lifted the commemorative edition from the podium. The leather binding gleamed under the candlelight. He opened to the marked page and began to read. The familiar words flowed from his lips. The hero struggling against the wilderness, the love interest waiting faithfully, the landscape descriptions that critics had praised as revolutionary. Margaret heard her father's voice beneath Blackwood's polished delivery, the rhythm of the sentences, the particular way each image built upon the last. Minutes passed. Blackwood performed beautifully, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. The audience sat transfixed. Margaret watched the page numbers as he turned them. 23, 24, 25. The altered chapter began on page 26. Blackwood turned the page. His voice continued without hesitation. "I have carried this burden for too long," he read. "The words that brought me fame were never truly mine. They came from another man, a man whose name I erased from history." The audience stirred. This was not the familiar climax they remembered. Blackwood frowned slightly, but continued, perhaps assuming a printing error. "I found his manuscript after his death. I saw its brilliance and knew I could never create something equal. So I claimed it as my own. I destroyed the evidence of his authorship. I built my reputation on his grave." Cecilia Price rose from her seat. "Edmund, stop!" But Blackwood seemed unable to stop. The words continued flowing from his mouth. His actor's training overriding his conscious mind. His name was William Holloway. He died believing his greatest work would never see the light. I am the thief who stole that light and called it my own. The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose in confusion and outrage. Journalists scrambled for their notebooks. Lady Drummond swooned dramatically into the arms of her companion. The Earl of Moray stood up, his face purple with indignation. Blackwood finally stopped reading. He stared at the page in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. His face had gone white as chalk. "This is not," he stammered. "This is not what I wrote." "You wrote nothing," Margaret said. She stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of a bell. Every head in the room turned toward her. "You have never written anything, Lord Blackwood. Every word that made your reputation was stolen. The voice from the hills belongs to William Holloway." "Your accusations against Daniel Ross were manufactured lies, paid for with bribes and false witnesses." She walked forward through the crowd, and people parted before her like water. "I have evidence. Letters from your own safe. Correspondence proving you destroyed an innocent man to protect your fraud. Payments to a German professor who never existed." Ross stood as well. "I am Daniel Ross," he announced. 8 years ago, this man fabricated evidence of plagiarism to destroy my career. He feared I was getting too close to the truth about his own theft. Everything he accused me of doing, he had already done himself. The room had fallen silent except for the scratching of journalists' pens. Blackwood stood frozen on the platform, the book still clutched in his hands. Cecilia had retreated to the edge of the stage, her beautiful face twisted with fury. "This is absurd," Blackwood finally managed. "A conspiracy. A plot by enemies who envy my success." "Your success?" Margaret reached the front of the room. She pulled the letters from her bodice and held them high. "These letters, written in your own hand, detail exactly how you paid to have Daniel Ross destroyed. The original manuscript of The Voice from the Hills sits in your private safe, in my father's handwriting. I have seen it myself." "You broke into my home. You are a thief." "And you are a murderer. Perhaps not by your own hand." "But my father died of a broken heart after watching his life's work credited to another. You killed him as surely as if you had held the knife yourself." The Earl of Moray stepped forward. "These are serious accusations, Miss Holloway, Margaret Holloway.
William Holloway's daughter. Miss Holloway, if what you say is true, this matter requires investigation by proper authorities. The altered reading alone proves tampering with evidence. The altered reading proves nothing, Cecilia interrupted. She has admitted to breaking into Lord Blackwood's home. She has admitted to orchestrating this entire spectacle. She is the criminal here, not Edmund. Then explain the letters, Ross said. Explain why Lord Blackwood's private safe contains a manuscript in William Holloway's hand. Explain the payments to the German professor. Explain why every piece of evidence points to exactly the story Miss Holloway has told. Blackwood seemed to shrink under the weight of their words. His silver hair no longer gleamed. His distinguished features had collapsed into something old and frightened. I can explain everything, he said, if you would simply give me time. You have had 8 years, Margaret said. My father had no time at all. She turned to face the audience. I do not ask you to believe me. I ask you to investigate. Examine the evidence. Compare handwriting. Follow the money. The truth has been buried for 8 years, but truth does not die. It waits. It survives. And eventually, it speaks. The journalists were already pushing toward the exits, desperate to file their stories. Society matrons whispered behind their fans. Men who had shaken Blackwood's hand now looked at him with new eyes. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not victory, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become justice. Blackwood dropped the commemorative edition. It fell to the platform with a sound like a closing door. This is not over, he said quietly. His eyes found Margaret through the chaos. You have no idea what I am capable of. I know exactly what you are capable of. And now, so does everyone else. Rain fell on Edinburgh for 3 days after the reading. The newspapers called it appropriate weather for the collapse of a literary empire. Every publication in Scotland carried some version of the story. Lord Blackwood accused of decades-long fraud. Celebrated author exposed as thief. Stolen voice finally speaks. Margaret read each article in her bookshop, surrounded by the familiar smell of paper and leather. Some accounts were sympathetic to her cause. Others questioned her methods, suggesting that tampering with a public reading constituted its own form of crime. A few defended Blackwood, dismissing the accusations as the ravings of a jealous woman seeking to destroy her betters. But the investigation had begun. The Royal Society appointed a committee to examine the evidence. Handwriting experts compared the manuscript in Blackwood's safe to verified samples of William Holloway's correspondence. Financial investigators traced the payments to Germany, following threads that Blackwood had thought buried forever. Ross visited daily, bringing news and coffee and the quiet companionship of a man who understood what it meant to wait for vindication. Cecilia Price has fled to London, he reported on the 4th morning. She left behind considerable debts and a collection of manuscripts that appear to belong to other authors. The young woman from the coffee house has already come forward. 3 others have followed. And Blackwood? Confined to his manor by order of the magistrate. His passport has been seized. The committee expects to deliver preliminary findings within the week. Margaret set down her teacup. I thought I would feel differently. When I imagined this moment, I imagined triumph, joy. But I feel hollow instead. Justice is not the same as healing. You have achieved one. The other will take longer. The bell above the shop door chimed. Margaret looked up to find Inspector Crawford standing in the entrance, his hat dripping rain onto the wooden floor. "Miss Holloway, may I have a word?" She gestured to the chair across from her. Crawford sat with the careful movements of a man carrying unwelcome news. "Lord Blackwood has made a statement," he said.
A full confession delivered to the committee this morning. Margaret's hands trembled.
"A confession?"
He admits to discovering William Holloway's manuscript after your father's death. He admits to publishing it under his own name. He admits to destroying evidence that might have revealed the truth.
"And Daniel Ross?"
He admits to manufacturing the plagiarism accusations. The German professor was an actor hired for the purpose. The letters were forged. The entire scandal was fabricated to protect Blackwood's secret.
Ross made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been a sob. 8 years, he whispered. 8 years of exile, of poverty, of watching everything I built crumble to dust. And now he simply admits it. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why confess now, when he fought so hard to maintain the lie?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "The evidence was overwhelming. But more than that, his support has collapsed. His publisher has severed ties.
His patrons have withdrawn their backing. The literary societies that once celebrated him have begun removing his name from their records. Edmund Blackwood built his entire life on the approval of others," Ross said slowly. "Without that approval, he has nothing. The confession is his final performance, his way of controlling the narrative, even in defeat." "There is something else," Crawford continued. "Blackwood has requested a meeting with you, Miss Holloway. He claims there are things he wishes to say that cannot be included in official testimony." "Why would I agree to see him?" "I cannot imagine any reason, but I am obligated to relay the request." Margaret looked out the rain-streaked window. Carriages passed on the gray street. Pedestrians hurried by with umbrellas raised against the weather. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business, while extraordinary things unfolded in quiet rooms. "Tell him I will come," she said. Ross protested. Crawford questioned her judgment. But Margaret had spent 8 years waiting for this moment. She would not let fear rob her of its completion. Blackwood Manor looked diminished in the rain. The formal gardens had gone untended since the scandal broke. Weeds pushed through the gravel pathways. Dead leaves gathered in the ornamental fountains. The great house itself seemed to sag, as if the walls understood that their master's power had crumbled. A single servant admitted Margaret to the library. The room that had once dazzled her with its treasures now felt like a mausoleum. Display cases stood empty, their contents seized as evidence. Shelves showed gaps where valuable manuscripts had been removed for examination. Edmund Blackwood sat by the cold fireplace. He had aged decades in a matter of days. His silver hair hung limp and unwashed. His distinguished features had collapsed into the face of an old man confronting mortality. "Miss Holloway," he said, "thank you for coming." Margaret remained standing. "I am not here for thanks. I am here because you asked. Say what you wished to say." Blackwood gestured weakly toward a chair. Margaret did not move. "Very well. I suppose I have forfeited the right to hospitality." He stared into the empty fireplace as if seeking warmth that no longer existed.
I found your father's manuscript in 1882, 3 years before his death. He had submitted it to my publisher seeking representation. The publisher passed it to me for evaluation. You were asked to evaluate my father's work? I was young then, ambitious. I had published 2 novels of my own, both modest successes. The publisher thought I might help an unknown author improve his craft. Blackwood's voice had lost its practiced resonance. He spoke now in the flat tones of a man with nothing left to perform. When I read The Voice from the Hills, I understood immediately that I would never write anything so good.
Not if I lived 1,000 years. Your father had captured something essential about Scotland, something I had been chasing my entire career without ever touching. So you stole it? Not immediately. I returned the manuscript with suggestions for revision. I told your father the work showed promise but needed development. I thought if I could discourage him, he might abandon the project. But he did not abandon it. No. He revised it, made it better, and when he resubmitted, I realized that delay would not work. Someone else would eventually recognize his genius. I had to act. Margaret felt the old anger rising, but beneath it something new, a terrible understanding of the smallness that had driven this man to destroy her father. I told the publisher the manuscript was derivative, Blackwood continued, unpublishable. I recommended rejection. When your father's health began to fail, I watched and waited. And when he died, I approached his widow with an offer to purchase his papers. My mother sold you my father's work? She did not know what she was selling. She needed money for doctors, for medicine, for funeral expenses. I paid her £50 for a trunk full of documents. She thought she was selling old notebooks and correspondence. £50. The price of a dying man's legacy. I changed the handwriting, Blackwood said. I hired scribes to recopy the manuscript in my own style. I burned the originals, or so I thought, but I kept one copy in my safe, a reminder of what I had done. Why keep evidence of your own crime? Blackwood finally looked at her. His eyes were empty, drained of the arrogance that had once made them shine. Because I needed to remember that I was a fraud. Every time I received an award, every time critics praised my genius, every time audiences wept at my readings, I would return to that safe and look at your father's handwriting and remind myself that none of it belonged to me. That is not remorse. That is self-torture dressed as penance. Perhaps. I have spent so many years performing that I no longer know the difference. Silence filled the library. Rain continued to fall against the windows, a soft percussion that seemed to mark the passing of something irretrievable. My father died believing his work had been rejected, Margaret said quietly. He spent his final years convinced that everything he had created was worthless. You did not just steal his words. You stole his faith in himself. I know. Do you? Do you understand what it means to watch your father fade away, convinced that his life amounted to nothing? Do you understand the cruelty of knowing that somewhere someone was celebrating the very work that had broken him? I cannot understand it. I can only acknowledge that I caused it. Margaret looked around the empty library, the gaps in the shelves, the seized display cases, the cold fireplace where warmth had once blazed.
What happens now? The courts will decide. Criminal charges for fraud, civil suits from the Ross family, from other authors I wronged. I will lose everything. The manor, the collections, the reputation that I built on stolen foundations.
And my father's name? The committee has already begun the process. The Voice from the Hills will be republished under William Holloway's authorship. Every copy of my edition will be destroyed. History will remember him as the true creator. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. It should have been his from the beginning. Yes, it should have been. She turned to leave. At the library door she paused. My father once told me that words are immortal, that they outlive the bodies that created them. You tried to kill his words, Lord Blackwood. You failed. She walked out into the rain. Spring came slowly to Edinburgh that year. The investigation concluded in April, confirming everything Margaret had claimed. Edmund Blackwood was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment. Cecilia Price was apprehended in London and faced similar charges for her role in the conspiracy against Daniel Ross. The first legitimate edition of The Voice from the Hills appeared in May, with William Holloway's name printed in gold letters on the cover. Margaret held the book in her hands and wept, alone in the shop her father had helped her build. Ross published his own work again, his reputation restored. Critics who had once dismissed him now praised his courage and resilience. He dedicated his new novel to Thomas Gray, the typesetter who had remembered truth when everyone else had chosen to forget. Margaret kept her bookshop. She did not seek fame or recognition. The literary societies invited her to speak, but she declined. Her father's voice had been restored. That was enough. On the anniversary of her father's death, she visited his grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard. The headstone had been updated with new words. William Holloway, author of The Voice from the Hills. Beloved father, his words endure. She placed a copy of the new edition against the stone and sat in the grass beside him. I found your voice, Papa, she whispered. The whole world will hear it now. The Edinburgh wind carried her words away, mixing them with the sounds of the city her father had loved. Somewhere, in bookshops and libraries, and the quiet rooms where readers lost themselves in stories, William Holloway's sentences were being read aloud. His images were forming in new minds. His voice was speaking again, after 8 years of enforced silence. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the wind, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something that might have been peace.